Hi guys, welcome back. So I have already talked about sequencing activities, but there's a specific process within this knowledge area to address it because sequencing is not so simple. I mean, in general, when we apply our common sense, it seems like that we just have to put things in order, and it's true, it's right. But in technology, in any other sector, when you are working on a project, you have to do some research to identify the correct sequence of things. For example, let's say there's a requirement, and the project is about creating a website where user can log in. Now, login is a simple activity, but when you analyze it, when you get down to implement it, you will need to create a register page where user can register, and this has to happen before login. So the in the sequence, first you have to create register and then login. Register wasn't even the requirement. Register wasn't even a primary requirement. It wasn't a business requirement. Business requirement was just to have a login page. But here, the non-functional requirement is to have a register page or a stakeholder requirement. But when you get down to implement register page, you realize that you need to have some kind of setup like a database system where we can store this information and use it for authentication when user try to log in using their credentials, password, and the user ID. So in the sequence, database setup will be the first event, and then you will have register page and then login. And of course, there will be many more activity like creating the UI and things like that. But to highlight that one simple requirement can lead to multiple activities, and those activities will determine the correct order. So when you get a project, when you get a work, you first need to analyze that work. You need to understand what all things should be done to implement that work, and then you can come up with the correct sequence. And I have used the example from the software industry, but let's say you are in construction. In construction, now honestly, I don't have much information about the construction, but I know there are certain orders in which you have to lay down the foundation, build walls, and then put floor and those kind of things. So there's a sequence in which you can construct a building or a road or any other project. So you have to first break down your work into smaller pieces, understand their dependencies, which is very important. So in our case, when I use the example of login and register, database setup is a dependency. Without that, we cannot have this implementation. So we have to put all of that information in the context and then come up with the sequence. You are identifying the links, the relationship between the activities, then they are documented, and yes, it is performed throughout the project. So it's a continuous process. And this is the input output diagram. The two techniques here, which are precedence diagramming method and the dependency determination and integration, I have added separate slides for them because these are important, and sometimes I have seen that there is a lot of confusion around them. So I will address them separately later in this video. But as far as input is concerned, we have project management plan, um, which will have schedule management plan and the scope baseline, and the project documents like activity attributes, activity list, assumption log, milestone list, EEFs, OPAs. All of this is our input. For techniques, along with these two, PDM and dependency determination, we have leads and lags. So let's look at leads and lags. Leads basically refers to the time frame which an event or activity need before something else can happen. So it's like a dependency. So for example, if you are, I was talking about construction. In construction, when you build something like a building, you have to construct something and leave it for a specified time before you can build something over it, like a floor or something. In case of software, let's say we first need to deploy some kind of software and leave it for 48 hours before we can do something else. So this 48 hours here is our lead time. Similarly, we have the lag time. Lag time refers to the time after event. So let's say we needed 48 hours after a certain thing. So that will be your lag time. In a regular project work, these things are represented in the form of milestones. So let's say the phase one consisted of writing a BRD. And while creating your project plan, while creating the sequence, you kept a lag of 15 days before your development team will start writing their technical documentation. So design BAs, they will write their BRD, then there will be a gap of 15 days, and then developers will write their technical analysis document. So if the end date of BRD writing was first without accounting for weekends, let's say if we keep the lag of 15 days, then it will be represented as BRD plus 15, and then the start date of technical analysis document will be 16th or 17th. Lead and lag refers to the time. If it's happening before the event, it's lead, and if it's happening after the event, it's lag. And project management information system is nothing else than these softwares like Jira and the Microsoft's project management tool. So you can simply enter the events and enter the dates or days. It will create a sequence for you. So and these tools are very commonly used nowadays in project management. Output is project schedule network diagram, project document updates, which will be in the form of activity attributes, activity list, assumption log, milestone list. And now let's talk about PDM and dependency determination integration techniques. And yes, if you have any doubt on leads and lags, please leave your comment. I will answer them. For that matter, any other issue. If you have any question, please leave your comment. I will answer them. So this is basically PDM. PDM is like a workflow diagram, where you put everything in a graphical manner. And here, events are called, or activities are called nodes. So it's like those rectangular boxes which you use in workflow diagram. In PDM, we also mention the relationship. So relationship, but before we talk about relationship, let's understand predecessors and successors. So let's go back this lead and lag. I was talking about the time which should, if it's happening before something. So predecessor basically are those activities which are happening before a dependent activity. If database setup is happening before the registration page setup, then database setup is the predecessor, and the login page setup will happen after registration page. So login will be successor of the registration page. So anything which happens before is the predecessor, and anything which happens after is the successor. And that is used in this technique to represent the sequence. There are four kind of relationships which are used in this technique to represent the flow, the sequence: finish to start, finish to finish, start to start, start to finish. So finish to start means that a successor activity cannot start until the dependent is finished. So dependent means like the login page. The login page is a dependent on registration page. So unless until registration page is finished, login cannot be started. Here I have used the example of fuel in the car. So if you put unless until you put fuel in the car, you cannot start the car. Similarly, if you don't hit the submit button on a login page, you cannot log in a system. So something has to happen, and that activity has to finish. Finish is the key word here. Hitting the submit button itself is an activity, itself is an action. So unless until this is completed, system cannot start the authentication process. So when you log into your Gmail account or wherever you log in, when you hit on the submit button, in the backend system starts the authentication process. And if it is successful, it will allow you to log in. Similarly, we have finish to finish. So here, both activities are finishing, but dependent cannot finish unless until the successor activity is finished. So unless until database setup is completed, we cannot start or rather complete the authentication process. And then we have start to start. I have used the example of server, but you can take any other example where we cannot start a particular activity, a process, unless until some other process is started. And then we have a start to finish. A successor activity cannot be finished until some other process is started. So if we need to start the process of user authentication and login, we need to finish the database verification of login credentials. And then we have the dependency determination, which is very important in sequencing activities. As you can see that no individual process can operate in isolation in project management or in general. So we need to identify these dependencies. And there are four kind of dependencies: mandatory dependencies, discretionary dependencies, external dependencies, internal dependencies. Mandatory dependencies are basically which are mandatory, like legal requirements, some contractual requirement. That will be your mandatory dependency. In our case, database setup would be a mandatory requirement for registration page setup, which would be mandatory for user login setup. Then we have discretionary dependencies. It is also referred as preferred logic or preferential logic or soft logic. As the term suggests, it's optional, but sometimes a company may emphasize upon it because it could be the standard practice. So there are shortcuts to do something, but the company follow the standard protocols, SOPs to do something, and as part of those guidelines and as a part of those standard procedures, there are certain requirements, certain dependencies which should be done. So in case of database setup, there are variety of database setup. For authentication also, and there are variety of techniques, technologies which can be used. But instead of going for a shortcut, you follow standard protocols. So in that case, that will become your discretionary dependencies. And then we have external dependencies. External dependencies are external requirements, external dependencies. Let's say we need to deploy our system on a server, the database and our website on server in order to begin testing and deployment and coding. But hosting is managed by external team. So in that case, we are dependent on them. In case of construction, let's say you have a vendor who is supplying you raw material and you are dependent on them. And then we have the internal dependencies. Internal dependencies, we can use the same example which we used for mandatory within the team. Usually they are mandatory, but sometimes they could be discretionary also. But largely these are dependencies which are part of your own team and its work. So they are within the control of your team. And these are the applications. We create activity attributes, activity list, assumption log, and milestone list with this sequence activity. So that's it for now. Thank you.